Good evening. Today I thought we'd take a look at a thing I own. I was recently at a market, actually a toy and train fair, when I found this. It's a destination board off a Bakerloo line train. The price was frankly a bargain, so I grabbed it. But what I really want to talk about is what's on the other side. Watford. Now, if you know the tube map, you'll know that Watford is on the Metropolitan line, not the Bakerloo line. So what's the deal? Well, for quite a while the Bakerloo line did go all the way to Watford. Not the Watford station on the Metropolitan line, which is some way out of the centre of town, but the station we now know as Watford Junction. Between Queen's Park and Harrow and Wealdstone, the Bakerloo line shadows the West Coast Main Line, and that's a key part of this story. This part of the West Coast Main Line was opened in 1838 by the London and Birmingham Railway, whose mission was basically to provide a fast connection between London and the Midlands. In 1846, the London and Birmingham became part of the London and North Western Railway. Now, I'm not saying the LNWR were a little bit up themselves, but they described themselves as the premier line and also the largest joint stock company in the world. I mean, the latter was true, but there's no need to be pompous about it. They were a company that cared about big, important trains. Expresses, heavy goods trains. The kind of traffic that warranted a Premier Line train. But even as the West Coast Main Line was being built, a new market was emerging. Commuters. A new lifestyle that was embraced by millions and changed the entire structure of cities. Railways made this possible, and railways were quick to cash in. They built lines specifically to serve the suburbs. They provided purpose-built locomotives and rolling stock. Some railways catered only to commuters. But not the LNWR. They considered commuter traffic a bit beneath them and embraced it only with some reluctance. It was a decision they'd come to regret. By the beginning of the 20th century, it was clear that they were losing out. Passenger numbers between Watford and London increased by 200% between 1884 and 1904, which indicated that there might well be many people between Watford and London who couldn't get the train but would. Their main line was potentially a huge source of revenue that they hadn't exploited. But the trouble was that, then as now, the West Coast Main Line was overcrowded. They couldn't add more stations without disrupting their fast trains. The solution they announced in 1906 was to build their own tube line. This would start at Watford Junction, head to Watford High Street, then rejoin the main line and run alongside it to just south of Kilburn. There it would dive into a tunnel ending with a loop under the LNWR's big London terminus at Euston. It would all be powered by electricity, which was the state of the art at the time. The scheme was approved in 1907 and became known as the New Line. The LNWR had jumped the gun a bit on this because they didn't really know anything about electrification. They were also a little bit wary about the tube sections. Underground lines were very expensive, and the stock market was rather shaky in 1907. So they decided to just ignore the southern end for now and started work at the northern end. Two things happened in 1909 that caused them to rethink. Firstly, they formed an alliance with the North London Railway, whereby the LNWR would work the North London's commuter trains. And secondly, the Metropolitan Railway announced that they were planning to build their own branch to Watford. At that time, it was going to go to the town centre, although, as we now know, things didn't quite pan out that way. The LNWR realised that maybe the tube section of the new line wasn't really necessary, since both the Metropolitan and the North London were better placed to serve the city. So in 1911, the southern section was formally abandoned. Instead, the line would go three ways. Some trains would run overground over existing track into Euston, which they still do, that's why you can get the overground from Euston. Some would go over the North London line via Wealdstone or Chalk Farm. And the rest would be taken care of by someone else. That someone else was the Baker Street and Waterloo Railway, or, as it was usually known, the Bakerloo Railway. The Bakerloo had opened in 1906. As you may have noticed, there was something of a trend for building tube lines in the early 20th century, but as the LNWR had learned, announcing a line was a lot easier than actually building it. The Bakerloo was part of the aggressively expansionist Underground Electric Railways of London Limited, which had managed to get itself built through a combination of American investment and founder Charles Tyson Yerkes' shifty business practices. Yerkes had died in 1905, and the house of cards that was his financial dealings collapsed. Not only did it transpire that his railways were nowhere near as financially secure as they appeared, but when the lines under construction opened over the next couple of years, they didn't carry anything like as many passengers as Yerkes had promised. In fact, the Bakerloo managed only 60% of projections. So it seemed that the prospect of an alliance between the LNWR and the Bakerloo offered benefits for both. The LNWR would be able to serve the West End and South London indirectly, and the Bakerloo would be able to serve the northern suburbs. The only trouble was that the Bakerloo line's northern terminus was at Edgware Road at that time. They would need to extend to Queen's Park, where they would run on to the new line, and then to Watford Junction. The first section of the new line to open in June 1912 was the section between Harrow and Willesden, and those first trains were steam-hauled. In February 1913, the section from Watford to Harrow came into use. Carpenter's Park was added in 1914. Meanwhile, in 1912, the extension of the Bakerloo line was formally authorised. There were to be 4 intermediate stations, at Paddington, Warwick Avenue, Maida Vale and Kilburn Park. The LNWR put some money into the pot for this. So too did the Great Western Railway, who owned the main line station at Paddington. The First World War held construction up, but the connection finally opened in 1915. The LNWR didn't actually complete their bit of the electrification scheme until 1916. Electrification was carried out using a 4-rail system in order to make it compatible with the Bakerloo trains. It used direct current, and as a result the line was also known as the Watford DC, as it still is to many people. There were 2 types of train used on the line. For the Euston and North London trains, this kind of stock was built by Metropolitan Camel, not to be confused with a Metropolitan Camel, which has no hands and cannot build anything. The electrical equipment in the first batch was supplied by Siemens, and in the second batch, which this carriage is part of, by Oerlikon. The other type was for the tube services. Initially, wartime shortages meant that new trains couldn't be obtained, so Underground Electric Railways of London made their trains up out of spare stock from their other lines. This was too low for the platforms and wasn't really suitable for the longer distances and higher speeds of the new line. This will be a recurring theme, spoiler alert. Oh, sorry, I should have said spoiler alert before I said never mind. In 1920, new purpose-built trains came into service. These were jointly designed by UERL and the LNWR. They were 4.5 inches higher than other tube trains, they had additional doors, and they were fitted with electric heating and parcels racks. The fleet was jointly owned between the 2 companies and were easily distinguished by the fact that they were painted in the LNWR's carriage livery, known as plum and split milk, or spilt milk, I've heard both. I think it's meant to be split milk, though. In 1923, the LNWR was amalgamated into the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, and that is why my sign says Watford LMS. This dates it to the period between 1923 and 1948. I don't know why it says Watford LMS and not, say, Watford JCN or Watford JN or some other abbreviation of junction. If you have any ideas, let me know in the comments. The tube trains, known as the Joint Stock or the Watford Joint Stock, were obsolete not long after opening. They were too slow and they couldn't be adapted to air-powered door operation, which was being rolled out across the underground network. In the 1920s, a new kind of train that would become known as the Standard Stock was under development for use on the deep-level tube lines. Rather than design a whole new train for the new line, the Standard Stock design was altered to include electro-pneumatic brakes, weak-field motor control, and a kind of adapter that made it able to couple up to the LNWR's surface trains. Very useful if there was a breakdown. Oh, and heaters, of course. The trouble was that the standard stock was rather lower than the old joint stock, there's that problem again, so the station platforms along the way were lowered to make them a compromise between the tube stock and the surface stock. And that's why on that line, to this day, you step down from an overground train and up from an underground train. These new trains came along in 1930 and were known as Watford replacement stock. But things were about to change again. In 1933, UERL became part of London Transport, who had big ideas for overhauling the network. In 1933, they added South Kenton to the line. In 1935, they considered running Northern Line trains to Watford as part of a Northern Line extension that never happened, but they would likely have shared part of the route with the Bakerloo. And in 1938, they introduced the 1938 stock. I don't know if you can guess how it got that name, but it was a vast improvement over everything the Underground had before. So much so that they didn't even need to build a modified version for the Watford service. So much so, in fact, that 38 stock trains on the Bakerloo line kept catching up with older stock, which was terribly embarrassing. As a result, the Bakerloo got priority allocation of new trains. However, this didn't turn out to be so great in the long run. The high speeds and long distances of the Watford service caused undue wear on the 38 stock, and passengers didn't like sitting in sideways seats all that way. So why do we not have Bakerloo line trains to Watford now? Well, as you might have gathered, the service was a bit of a pain for London Transport. What they had on the Bakerloo line was a service that operated like an underground train between Elephant and Castle and Queen's Park, then like a mainline railway from Queen's Park to Watford. The new line required special timetabling to fit around the LMS trains, which in turn was difficult to fit around the high-frequency services of the rest of the Bakerloo. Rolling stock either had to be specially designed, like the joint stock, or they had to be unsuitable for the requirements of the line, like the 38 stock, or to be a compromise like the Watford replacement stock. In 1948, the railways of Britain were nationalised. The LMS became part of British Railways. The Underground was nationalised, but as part of London Transport, which was still called London Transport, but was now nationalised. It's complicated. For British Railways' part, they too found the Watford line inconvenient, for much the same reasons. In fact, while the Underground had gone through 3 generations of trains by 1948, BR was still using the old LNWR trains because it just wasn't worth building new trains for one service. But the advantage BR had over the Underground was that they actually owned the line north of Queen's Park. From the 1960s to the 80s, there was something of a spirit of austerity on British Rail, despite outward modernisation. The government had a constant BDI on them, and the Bakerloo line fell victim to this. BR reduced the number of slots they could use to get to Watford. In 1970, the line beyond Queen's Park was converted to a higher voltage, which was standard for BR but put a strain on the Underground trains. On the 24th of September 1982, Bakerloo line trains to Watford were officially ended. Trains would now terminate at Stonebridge Park, although a couple of years later BR relented in the face of public demand and allowed trains to come all the way up to Harrow and Wealdstone, which is where the train terminates today. These days, London Transport's successors, TfL, once again run trains to Watford Junction, but this time it's part of the Overground. It's soon to be renamed the Lioness Line, but I suspect it will be a while before the name Watford DC fades from memory. There are a lot of little legacies of the old service, from the odd platforms to the LNWR lettering on some of the stations to the Bakerloo line service patterns. Oh, and this sign on my bookcase. Well, I do hope you enjoyed this direct current tale from the tube. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. And I'd be interested to know what you think. Should the Bakerloo still go to Watford? It occurs to me that given that the Metropolitan doesn't exactly serve the centre of Watford, an underground service might be useful. I would like to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your support. You are the lowered platform to my compromised rolling stock. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.